Zarathul had witnessed the birth and death of stars. The ancient being had observed civilizations rise from primitive mud dwellers to cosmic empires spanning galaxies. In the endless cycles of existence, few things surprised the immortal observer anymore. Yet as the sleek vessel approached the small blue-green world called Earth, something stirred within the depths of Zarathul's consciousness that hadn't moved in millennia. The assignment seemed routine. Another species had achieved basic space travel and warranted evaluation for potential inclusion in the galactic collective. The humans, as they called themselves, had only recently developed faster-than-light communication and were still confined to their home system. By all accounts, they were unremarkable. Zarathul materialized on the observation deck of the survey ship. Their ethereal form shifting between states of matter as emotions fluctuated. The captain, a sturdy Kralix with 4 arms and crystalline skin, approached with obvious reverence. "Honored observer, we've completed our initial scans. The species shows typical developmental patterns for a Class C civilization. Basic technology, tribal conflicts, limited resource management. Standard recommendation would be observation for another 1,000 cycles before contact." The observer's attention drifted to the planet below. Something felt different about this world, though Zarathul couldn't identify what. The energy signatures were unusual, chaotic yet purposeful. Most developing worlds showed predictable patterns of growth, but Earth's readings fluctuated wildly across all spectrums. "Show me their recent conflicts," Zarathul commanded, their voice resonating through multiple dimensions. The holographic display activated, showing various human battlefields across their recorded history. The observer had seen countless wars among developing species. Usually they followed predictable patterns: resource disputes, territorial expansion, ideological differences. But as the images flowed past, something caught Zarathul's attention. The humans fought differently. Most species, when faced with superior force, would surrender or flee. It was logical, efficient, maximized survival rates. But these humans, they fought impossible battles. They held positions that couldn't be held. They charged against overwhelming odds not out of stupidity, but from some incomprehensible drive that transcended rational thought. "Fascinating," Zarathul murmured, watching human soldiers in ancient armor face down creatures that should have scattered them like leaves. "Show me more recent conflicts." The display shifted to what humans called their world wars. Zarathul had observed similar planetary conflicts before, but never with such intensity. The scale wasn't what impressed the observer, but rather the individual acts that defied all logic. A human pilot, his aircraft damaged and ammunition spent, deliberately flew into an enemy vessel rather than retreat. Another group of humans, surrounded and outnumbered 50-1, fought for days without hope of rescue. Civilians threw themselves between armed soldiers and their neighbors, choosing death over the safety of silence. "This behavior pattern isn't sustainable," the Kralix captain observed. Such reckless aggression should have caused their extinction. But Zarathul noticed something the captain missed. For every display of seemingly suicidal bravery, there was an equal demonstration of compassion. Humans who risked everything to save complete strangers. Soldiers who shared their last food with enemy prisoners. Civilians who gave up their shelter to protect those they'd never met. The contradictions fascinated the observer. Most species developed along predictable emotional and social lines. They became either increasingly aggressive or increasingly passive as they advanced. The humans seemed to embody both extremes simultaneously. "Prepare a deep reconnaissance mission," Zarathul decided. "I want to observe them directly." The captain's crystalline features shifted to show concern. "Honored observer, direct contact is forbidden until they achieve Class B status. The collective protocols are clear." "Not contact," Zarathul corrected. "Observation, I'll take humanoid form and study them from within their society. Something about this species doesn't match our models." 3 days later, Zarathul walked the streets of New York City in carefully constructed human form. The sensory experience was overwhelming at first. Humans lived in such close proximity to each other, their emotions creating a constant background noise of joy, fear, anger, love, and hope, all mixed together. The observer chose to focus on what humans called emergency services, reasoning that crisis situations would reveal their true nature most clearly. Assuming the identity of a paramedic, Zarathul began responding to calls throughout the city. The first few incidents matched expectations. Humans helping humans, basic altruistic behavior found in most social species. But as days passed, the patterns grew more complex. Zarathul responded to a building fire where human firefighters repeatedly entered a collapsing structure to rescue people they'd never met. The logical approach would have been to evacuate whoever could be reached safely and accept losses. Instead, these humans risked their lives again and again, emerging with unconscious strangers, then immediately planning to go back for more. "Why do you do this?" Zarathul asked one firefighter during a brief rest. The human, face streaked with soot and exhaustion evident in every line of his body, looked confused by the question. "Because people are still inside, but the risk to yourself is enormous. The building could collapse at any moment." The firefighter stared at Zarathul as if the observer had spoken in an alien language. "Yeah, and there's still people inside." The circular logic baffled Zarathul. The human couldn't seem to conceive of any other response, not because he was stupid or hadn't considered the danger, but because the alternative simply didn't exist in his mental framework. That night, Zarathul responded to a multi-car accident on a busy highway. Upon arrival, they found chaos. Vehicles were scattered across the roadway, some overturned, others crushed against barriers. But what struck the observer wasn't the destruction, but the response. Complete strangers had stopped their vehicles and were helping victims. A businessman in an expensive suit was holding pressure on a bleeding wound while talking calmly to a terrified child. A young woman was directing traffic around the accident scene, risking her own safety to prevent additional collisions. An elderly man was sharing his jacket with a victim in shock, despite the cold night air. No one had been ordered to help. There was no government mandate or social pressure. These humans simply saw others in need and responded without hesitation. As Zarathul worked to stabilize a critically injured driver, the human whispered, "My daughter! Is she okay? She was in the back seat." The observer quickly scanned the area and spotted a small human child being comforted by a group of strangers near one of the ambulances. "She's safe. Others are caring for her." Tears streamed down the injured human's face. "Thank them. Please thank them." The man lost consciousness before Zarathul could explain that thanks weren't necessary. The humans helping his daughter weren't doing it for gratitude or reward. They were simply being human. Over the following weeks, Zarathul observed similar patterns repeatedly, humans rushing into burning buildings to save pets they didn't own. Medical personnel working 18-hour shifts during emergencies, far beyond what their physiology could safely handle. Citizens organizing themselves to help during natural disasters, sharing resources and labor freely. But the observer also witnessed the darker aspects of humanity. Greed, cruelty, violence, and hatred were equally present. Humans were capable of breathtaking evil alongside their moments of transcendent good. The contradictions defied every model Zarathul had developed over eons of observation. The breakthrough came during what humans called a terrorist attack. Zarathul was off duty, observing human social patterns in a crowded marketplace when the explosion occurred. The blast knocked dozens of humans to the ground, creating immediate chaos and panic. The observer's first instinct was to record the flight response, as most species exhibited clear behavioral patterns during sudden threats. Instead, Zarathul watched something extraordinary unfold. Yes, some humans fled, but others ran toward the explosion. Medical professionals, off-duty police officers, even civilians with no special training rushed toward the danger to help the injured. Within minutes, an impromptu medical station had formed using supplies from nearby shops, staffed by volunteers who had never worked together before. A young human woman, her own leg clearly broken, was helping to bandage another victim's wounds. An elderly man was using his shirt to create pressure bandages while talking calmly to a panicking child. A group of teenagers had organized themselves into a supply chain, bringing water and medical supplies from surrounding buildings. "This doesn't make sense," Zarathul muttered, forgetting to maintain human speech patterns. "What doesn't make sense?" asked a nearby human, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who was helping to coordinate the volunteer medical efforts. Zarathul struggled to frame the question in human terms. "The danger. You should be fleeing from the threat, seeking safety for yourself. Instead, you're all running toward it." The woman paused in her work, giving the observer a strange look. "These people are hurt. They need help. But you could be killed. There could be secondary explosions, additional attackers. Your logical choice is self-preservation." Logic? The woman's expression shifted to something Zarathul couldn't quite interpret. "I suppose logic would say to run away and let other people deal with it. But I can't walk past someone who's hurting and do nothing. I wouldn't be able to live with myself." She returned to her work, dismissing the conversation as if the observer's question was somehow fundamentally flawed rather than rationally sound. That night, Zarathul stood alone on the observation deck of the survey ship, reviewing the day's events. The captain approached cautiously. "Honored observer, the crew is curious about your extended study. Have the humans demonstrated any capabilities that would affect their classification?" Zarathul was quiet for a long moment, processing observations that challenged fundamental assumptions about species development. "What do you know about the Destroyer War?" The captain's crystalline form darkened with memory. "The greatest threat the galaxy has ever faced. The destroyers consumed 17 civilizations before the collective finally stopped them." "Why do you ask?" "The destroyers were unstoppable because they had eliminated every weakness in their society. No compassion, no mercy, no irrational emotional responses, pure efficiency in service of their goals. They conquered species far more advanced than these humans with laughable ease." "Yes, honored observer, it took the combined military might of 47 civilizations to defeat them." Zarathul gestured toward Earth. "These humans would have beaten them." The captain's form flickered with shock. "Honored observer, with respect, that's impossible. The humans have barely achieved spaceflight. They lack advanced weapons, shield technology, faster than light travel. They couldn't possibly—" "You misunderstand," Zarathul interrupted. "The destroyers failed because they couldn't comprehend illogical responses. They calculated optimal strategies based on rational behavior patterns. But humans don't behave rationally when faced with threats to others." The observer pulled up tactical analyses from the Destroyer War, showing them alongside human conflict patterns. "Look at this battle. The destroyers surrounded a collective fleet, offering terms of surrender in exchange for civilian evacuation ships being allowed to escape. Standard military doctrine suggested accepting the terms, minimizing casualties. Instead, the fleet commander chose to fight, buying time for civilian evacuation at the cost of his entire force. A noble sacrifice, the captain acknowledged, though ultimately futile, as the destroyers simply hunted down the evacuation ships afterward." "Exactly," rational behavior patterns. Now observe this human conflict. The display showed human soldiers in what their historians called the Battle of Thermopylae. 300 warriors facing an army of thousands, knowing they would die, but holding their position anyway. The tactical situation is nearly identical, Zarathul continued, but see how the humans respond differently. They don't just accept death as the price of duty. They make the enemy pay such a horrific cost that it changes the entire nature of the conflict. More examples flowed across the display. Human defenders of Stalingrad turning every building into a fortress, fighting room by room for months. Allied soldiers on D-Day charging into machine gun fire because others were counting on them. Civilians in occupied territories risking torture and death to hide refugees they'd never met. The destroyers calculated that resistance would cease when casualties reached optimal levels, Zarathul explained. But humans don't calculate optimal casualty levels. They calculate whether someone needs help, then they provide it, regardless of cost. The captain studied the data thoughtfully. But honored observer, this same irrationality could make them incredibly dangerous if they don't consider logical limitations. Yes, Zarathul agreed. They could be the most dangerous species in the galaxy, or the most noble, possibly both simultaneously. The observer had spent centuries watching civilizations rise and fall, but never had one species presented such contradictions. Humans were capable of breathtaking cruelty and transcendent compassion, often from the same individuals. They made decisions that defied logic, yet somehow achieved results that pure logic couldn't match. "What do you recommend?" the captain asked. Zarathul was quiet for a long time, watching Earth turn slowly below them. Somewhere on that planet, humans were probably running into danger to help strangers at this very moment. Somewhere else, other humans were probably planning acts of stunning cruelty. The same species that had produced Hitler had also produced people who hid his victims at the cost of their own lives. "I recommend," Zarathul said finally, "that we continue observing. This species doesn't fit our classification system. They're not Class C, but they're not Class B either. They're something entirely new." The captain waited for more detailed instructions, but Zarathul was lost in thought. In all the observer's eons of existence, across countless species and civilizations, none had prepared them for humanity's fundamental contradiction. A species that could simultaneously embody the best and worst impulses of sentient life, often in the same individuals, sometimes in the same decisions. As the observation ship settled into a longer orbit, Zarathul began planning extended studies. Whatever humans were, they represented something unprecedented in galactic civilization. The observer had a feeling that understanding them would require more than standard evaluation protocols. It would require learning to think like a human, which meant learning to embrace contradictions that logic said shouldn't be possible. For an immortal being dedicated to understanding the universe through rational observation, it was the most fascinating challenge Zarathul had encountered in millennia. The study of humanity had begun. Months passed as Zarathul continued the deep observation mission. The immortal being had requested extended time to study human behavior patterns, claiming the species presented unique characteristics that required thorough analysis. The truth was more complex. For the first time in eons, Zarathul was genuinely puzzled by a species, and the puzzle was becoming an obsession. The observer had shifted focus from emergency response to what humans called ordinary life, seeking to understand the source of their extraordinary responses during crises. The research led to an unsettling discovery. The same contradictory patterns existed in everyday human behavior. Zarathul observed a human teacher spending her own money to buy supplies for students whose families couldn't afford them. When questioned, she seemed baffled by the observer's interest in what she considered normal behavior. "They're children," she said, as if that explained everything. "They need to learn. But these aren't your biological offspring," Zarathul pressed, genuinely confused. You gain no genetic advantage from their success. The expenditure of your resources for unrelated individuals is evolutionarily counterproductive. The teacher stared at the observer for a long moment. Are you feeling okay? That's a really strange way to think about kids. Similar patterns emerged everywhere. Humans regularly sacrificed personal advantage for abstract principles. They formed emotional bonds with individuals who offered no practical benefits. They consistently chose difficult paths when easier alternatives existed, not from stupidity, but from adherence to incomprehensible moral frameworks. The observer decided to study human child-rearing practices, reasoning that understanding their developmental process might explain their adult contradictions. This investigation led to the most disturbing discovery yet. Human parents invested enormous resources in offspring with no guarantee of return. Unlike most species, where parental investment correlated directly with offspring survival probability, humans poured resources into children regardless of their physical or mental capabilities. Even more puzzling, they often invested additional resources in children who were unlikely to survive or reproduce. Zarathul observed a human family caring for a child with severe genetic abnormalities. The cost in time, energy, and resources was enormous. The child would likely never be independent, never contribute economically, never reproduce. By any rational measure, the family would benefit from redirecting those resources to their healthy children. Instead, they fought fiercely for every possible treatment, every moment of comfort, every small improvement in their child's quality of life. The parents aged visibly from the stress, their other children received less attention and resources, their financial stability crumbled under medical costs. Why? Zarathul asked the mother during a chance encounter at the hospital. Why do you continue this struggle when the outcome is predetermined? The woman, exhausted beyond measure, looked at the observer with eyes that held depths of pain and determination that defied measurement. Because she's my daughter, because every moment of her life matters. Because love isn't conditional on what someone can give back to you. The observer struggled to process this response. Love without reciprocal benefit was a concept that challenged fundamental assumptions about biological behavior. Yet this human spoke of it as if it were as natural as breathing. But the resource allocation is inefficient, Zarathul persisted. You could help many more individuals by redirecting your efforts. I'm not trying to help many more individuals, the woman replied quietly. I'm trying to help her. She's not a resource allocation problem. She's my child. That night, Zarathul reported findings to the survey ship that left the crew unsettled. The captain requested clarification multiple times, unable to accept that a species could survive while systematically making inefficient decisions. Honored observer, perhaps we're misunderstanding their behavior. Surely there must be hidden advantages we're not perceiving. I initially assumed the same, Zarathul admitted, but extended observation confirms the pattern. Humans regularly choose immediate disadvantage for abstract principles. They help individuals who cannot reciprocate. They sacrifice personal gain for the welfare of strangers. They invest resources in projects that will only benefit future generations they'll never meet. The observer pulled up footage from a human disaster relief effort. Watch this. A volcanic eruption has destroyed an island community. Humans from around the world send resources, volunteer time, risk their own safety to help people they've never met and will never see again. The economic cost is enormous. The practical benefit to the helpers is zero. There must be some social or political advantage, the captain insisted. I thought so too. But observe more closely. Most of the help is anonymous. No recognition, no reciprocal agreements, no future benefits. They simply see others suffering and respond by alleviating that suffering. The crew struggled to accept such behavior as evolutionary viable. In their experience, species that consistently made inefficient choices became extinct long before achieving spaceflight. Zarathul decided to investigate human history more thoroughly, seeking the source of these contradictory survival strategies. The research revealed something unprecedented in galactic civilization. Humans had survived not despite their apparently irrational behaviors, but because of them. Their tendency to help unrelated individuals had led to rapid knowledge sharing and technological advancement. Their willingness to sacrifice for abstract principles had created stable societies that could function across genetic and tribal lines. Their investment in seemingly useless individuals had led to unexpected innovations and solutions. The disabled child Zarathul had observed earlier was part of a family that included a brilliant scientist father whose research was motivated by his daughter's condition. His work was leading to breakthrough treatments that would help thousands of children with similar conditions. The inefficient resource allocation was generating benefits the original calculations had never considered. But the deeper mystery remained. How had humans developed such behaviors in the first place? The answer came from studying their evolutionary history. Unlike most sentient species, humans had evolved under extreme environmental pressure while maintaining strong social bonds. They had faced predators, climate changes, and resource scarcity that should have killed them, but survived through unprecedented levels of cooperation. Early humans had shared food during famines, cared for sick and injured tribe members, and defended their groups against impossible odds. The individuals who made these irrational choices had survived more often than those who made logical ones. Over time, the capacity for illogical altruism had become embedded in their genetic and cultural programming. Most species developed sentience through either individual excellence or hive mind efficiency. Humans had developed it through chaotic, contradictory, emotionally driven cooperation between independent individuals. The result was a species that could function as a collective without losing individual identity and maintain individual identity without abandoning collective responsibility. Zarathul was analyzing these findings when an emergency alert interrupted the research. A collective exploration vessel had encountered hostile forces in a nearby system and was requesting assistance. The observer's ship was the closest available response. "Honored observer," the captain announced. "We're receiving distress calls from the scientific vessel Harmony of Understanding. They've encountered an unknown aggressive species and are requesting immediate assistance." Zarathul examined the tactical data. 3 collective ships were under attack by a technologically superior force. The attackers were using energy weapons and tactics that suggested they were remnants of the destroyer civilization, thought extinct for centuries. "How many enemy vessels?" Zarathul asked. "Scans indicate 12 attack ships, heavily armed. Our vessel is a survey ship with minimal weaponry. Standard protocol suggests we await backup from collective defense forces." The observer calculated response times. Backup would arrive approximately 4 hours after the research vessel's projected destruction. Logical analysis suggested retreating and reporting the incident for future investigation. "Set course for the battle zone," Zarathul commanded instead. "Honored observer, our tactical capabilities are insufficient. We cannot meaningfully affect the outcome while ensuring our own survival." Zarathul paused, realizing they were applying human behavioral patterns to a situation where logical analysis was more appropriate. The irony was disturbing. Had extended observation of humanity affected the observer's own decision-making processes? "You're correct," Zarathul admitted. "Maintain current position and begin long-range scanning. We'll gather intelligence for the defense forces." As they watched the distant battle, Zarathul reflected on how different a human response would be. Humans would have immediately rushed to help, regardless of tactical disadvantage. They would have improvised weapons, developed impossible strategies, and probably found a way to save everyone while defeating a superior enemy. The thought was both admirable and terrifying. The research vessels were destroyed 6 minutes later. The enemy force departed without investigating the survey ship, apparently satisfied with eliminating the immediate threat. When backup arrived hours later, they found only debris and radiation signatures. "This confirms our worst fears," the Defense Force commander reported. "The destroyers aren't extinct. Some faction survived and has been rebuilding. These attacks suggest they're testing collective defenses before launching a larger assault." Zarathul studied the attack patterns and ship designs. The technology was indeed destroyer-based, but showed significant advancement. Whoever these attackers were, they had learned from their previous defeat and improved their capabilities. "What's the collective response?" Zarathul asked. "Standard defensive protocols. We'll establish picket lines around critical systems. Improve early warning networks, and begin developing countermeasures to their new technologies." The observer considered this response against what they had learned about human tactical thinking. Humans wouldn't establish defensive positions and wait for the enemy to choose the time and place of attack. They would hunt the attackers down, carry the fight to them, accept enormous risks to prevent enemies from becoming stronger. "May I suggest an alternative approach?" Zarathul proposed. "Active hunting parties, aggressive reconnaissance, pressure campaigns to prevent them from consolidating their forces." The commander's expression showed polite skepticism. "Honored observer, such tactics would expose our forces to unacceptable risk. Our mathematical models show defensive positioning optimizes survival probabilities." "And if the enemy uses that time to build overwhelming forces?" "Then we'll have preserved maximum resources for the final engagement." Zarathul realized the fundamental difference between human and collective strategic thinking. The collective optimized for acceptable losses. Humans optimized for victory, regardless of cost. Both approaches could work, but against an enemy that didn't follow standard rational behavior patterns, human thinking might prove more effective. The observer requested permission to return to Earth and continue the study mission. The growing destroyer threat made understanding humanity's combat effectiveness increasingly relevant to galactic security. Back on Earth, Zarathul began studying human military history with new focus. The patterns were consistent across cultures and time periods. When facing superior enemies, humans didn't calculate acceptable loss ratios or optimal defensive positions. They found ways to win. Sometimes those ways defied every principle of rational strategy. During their Second World War, humans had launched amphibious assaults against fortified beaches held by superior forces. The logical analysis suggested massive casualties for minimal gains. Instead, the impossible attacks had succeeded, turning the tide of the entire war. The observer studied the individual stories behind these strategic victories. They weren't the result of superior technology or overwhelming numbers. They succeeded because individual humans made irrational choices at crucial moments. A paratrooper with a broken leg continued fighting for hours instead of seeking medical attention because his unit needed him. A naval officer chose to ram his damaged ship into an enemy vessel rather than retreat, buying time for other ships to escape. A resistance fighter revealed crucial intelligence under torture, but only after her comrades had escaped, accepting death to protect strangers. Each individual decision violated logical self-preservation protocols, but the cumulative effect created military capabilities that purely rational forces couldn't match. Human armies fought harder when casualties mounted, not because they were unaware of the danger, but because others were depending on them. "It's not that they're unafraid," Zarathul realized during one observation session. "They're terrified, but they do it anyway." The observer was watching a group of firefighters preparing to enter a burning chemical plant. Their equipment was inadequate, their safety protocols insufficient, their survival odds poor. Every rational calculation suggested they should wait for better equipment or more personnel. Instead, they checked their gear one last time and walked into the flames. "Why?" Zarathul asked one of the firefighters afterward as he received treatment for severe burns. "Because people were inside," the human replied, the same circular logic that had baffled the observer months earlier. "But you could have died. Your injuries are severe. You have a family that depends on you." The firefighter was quiet for a moment, considering. "Yeah, I thought about that, but I also thought about the people inside, probably thinking no one was coming for them. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try." Zarathul finally understood. Humans didn't make irrational choices because they couldn't calculate risks. They made those choices because the alternative was unacceptable to them on a fundamental level. Their definition of acceptable outcomes included factors that rational analysis never considered. For humans, survival wasn't the highest priority. Living with themselves after their choices was. This realization transformed the observer's understanding of human tactical capabilities. In a war against the destroyers, rational species would calculate acceptable losses and fight to minimize them. Humans would calculate what they could live with afterward and fight to achieve that, regardless of cost. The difference could determine the survival of galactic civilization. As Zarathul prepared to file a preliminary report, new intelligence arrived from the outer systems. The destroyer attacks were escalating. 3 more research vessels had been destroyed and a collective colony ship had gone missing. The enemy was growing bolder and more aggressive. The observer realized that academic study was becoming a luxury the galaxy couldn't afford. The time for theoretical analysis was ending. Soon, every available resource would be needed for the coming war. But first, Zarathul needed to complete one more phase of human observation. The observer had seen how humans responded to individual crises and local threats. Now they needed to understand how humanity would respond to an existential threat to their entire species. That understanding would determine whether Zarathul recommended bringing humans into the galactic community as allies or keeping them isolated for everyone's protection. Because a species that could defeat the destroyers could probably conquer everyone else as well. The question was whether humans would choose to save the galaxy or rule it. The decision came faster than Zarathul had anticipated. 3 weeks after the observers returned to Earth, emergency communications flooded all collective channels. The destroyers had launched a coordinated assault on 5 major systems simultaneously, their forces far larger and more advanced than previous intelligence had suggested. "All survey missions are terminated immediately," the emergency directive read. "All observers return to collective space for reassignment to military intelligence duties. This is not a drill." Zarathul stood in human form on a New York City rooftop, watching the stars that held civilizations now fighting for their survival. The logical choice was clear. Return to the survey ship, abandon this primitive world, and contribute to the collective's defense efforts. Instead, the observer sent a message requesting permission to reveal the truth to humanity. The response was swift and unequivocal. Request denied. Species contamination protocols strictly forbidden during military emergency. Report for immediate reassignment. Zarathul faced the first truly moral choice of their existence. Obey orders and abandon billions of humans to face extinction without even knowing the true nature of the universe. Or violate fundamental collective protocols to give them a chance to defend themselves. The answer came from months of observing human decision-making patterns. When faced with choosing between rules and saving lives, humans consistently chose to save lives. The observer realized they had absorbed more human thinking than intended. 3 hours later, Dr. Sarah Chen, the director of the United Nations Emergency Response Division, received a visitor who would change everything. "I need to speak with your highest-ranking officials immediately," Zarathul told her, having shed the paramedic disguise for a more professional appearance. "Your species is in immediate danger, and I have information that could help you survive." Dr. Chen, a pragmatic woman accustomed to handling global crises, studied the stranger carefully. Something about their manner suggested this wasn't another conspiracy theorist or attention seeker. "What kind of danger?" she asked cautiously. "The kind that has already destroyed 17 civilizations across this galaxy. And they're coming for Earth next." Within hours, Zarathul was addressing a closed session of world leaders, their words being simultaneously translated into dozens of languages. The observer had decided that if humanity was to have any chance of survival, they needed the truth. "You are not alone in the universe," Zarathul began, their human form flickering slightly as emotions overwhelmed their shape-shifting controls. "Intelligent life exists throughout the galaxy, organized into what we call the collective. Your world has been under observation for evaluation as potential members." The room erupted in questions, accusations, and demands for proof. Zarathul provided technical specifications for faster-than-light communication, detailed star maps of inhabited systems, and mathematical proofs of concepts that human science wouldn't discover for centuries. The evaluation was routine until 3 days ago, the observer continued once order was restored. "An ancient enemy we thought destroyed has returned with advanced technology and a simple goal, the complete extinction of all other intelligent life in the galaxy." President Martinez of the Global Defense Council leaned forward. "Why are you telling us this? If we're primitive compared to galactic civilization, what could we possibly do?" "Because," Zarathul said, choosing words carefully, "I have observed your species for months. Your behavioral patterns suggest you might be more effective against this enemy than any other species in the galaxy." The observer explained humanity's unique approach to impossible situations, their tendency to fight hardest when odds were worst, their incomprehensible willingness to sacrifice for strangers. "The destroyers calculate that resistance will cease when casualties reach optimal levels," Zarathul concluded. "But humans don't stop fighting when casualties mount. You fight harder. This response pattern is unprecedented in their experience." Dr. Chen asked the question everyone was thinking. "How long do we have?" "Based on their current advance rate through collective space, approximately 18 months before they reach Earth. The collective defense forces are fighting delaying actions, but they cannot stop this enemy. They can only slow them down." The following months became a frantic period of global mobilization, unlike anything in human history. The proof of alien civilization had unified humanity in ways that centuries of diplomacy had failed to achieve. National boundaries became administrative conveniences as the species prepared to defend their world. Zarathul served as technical advisor, sharing defensive technologies that humans could manufacture with their existing industrial capacity. But the observer was careful not to provide weapons technology that might be too advanced for human psychology to handle responsibly. "Why the restrictions?" General Harrison asked during one planning session. "If these destroyers are as dangerous as you claim, we need every advantage available." "Because the weapons technology that could stop them could also destroy your civilization," Zarathul replied. "I've seen species tear themselves apart with advanced technology they couldn't handle responsibly. If you survive this war, it will be because of human capabilities, not alien technology." The observer had made a calculated decision. If humanity was going to join the galactic community, they needed to do so as equals, not as children dependent on superior technology they didn't understand. As the months passed, Zarathul watched humanity transform itself with characteristic determination and ingenuity. Industrial production shifted entirely to defensive preparations. Scientists worked around the clock developing new technologies based on theoretical principles the observer had provided. Military units trained for combat scenarios that pushed the boundaries of physical and psychological endurance. But most importantly, Humans began displaying the behavioral patterns that had first caught Zarathul's attention on a species-wide scale. Civilian populations voluntarily relocated from major cities to reduce casualties from orbital bombardment. Families sent their children to underground facilities while parents remained above ground to maintain defensive systems. Military units practiced fighting in impossible scenarios, assuming they would face overwhelming odds and developing tactics for victory rather than survival. "They're preparing for total war," Zarathul reported to the survey ship, which remained hidden in Earth's outer system. "But not the kind the collective fights. They're preparing to win or die trying, with no consideration for acceptable losses." The captain's response reflected growing concern from collective leadership. "Honored observer, reports from the front lines are disturbing. Human tactical recommendations are being implemented by some defense force units, resulting in unexpected successes. However, casualty rates among these units are significantly higher than standard protocols allow." "But they're winning battles that should be impossible," Zarathul pointed out. "Yes, which is causing philosophical debates throughout the collective. Some argue we should adopt human tactics. Others insist that victory achieved through unacceptable losses is no victory at all." The observer realized that humanity's impact on galactic civilization would extend far beyond their military contributions. Their approach to problem-solving challenged fundamental assumptions about acceptable costs and rational behavior. 12 months after first contact, advanced warning systems detected the destroyer fleet entering the solar system. The moment of truth had arrived. Humanity's response was everything Zarathul had expected, and more than the observer had dared hope for. Instead of establishing defensive positions around Earth and waiting for attack, human commanders immediately launched every available vessel toward the enemy. Military doctrine called it a suicide charge. Human logic called it taking the fight to them before they could establish orbital superiority. Zarathul monitored the battle from the UN Defense Coordination Center, watching humans implement tactics that violated every principle of rational warfare. Smaller ships rammed larger vessels when their weapons proved ineffective. Pilots flew damaged spacecraft into enemy formations as improvised missiles. Ground-based installations continued firing until destroyed, even when retreat was possible. "This is insane," Dr. Chen muttered, watching casualty reports flood the command center. "We're losing ships faster than the projections said we could afford." "But look at the enemy casualties," Zarathul pointed out. "The destroyers expected resistance to collapse when you reached projected breakpoints. Instead, your forces are fighting harder as losses mount." The battle raged for 14 hours. Human forces were outnumbered and outgunned, facing technology centuries more advanced than their own. According to every rational analysis, they should have been destroyed within the first hour. Instead, they lasted long enough for collective reinforcements to arrive. The final phase of the battle became legendary throughout galactic civilization. Human and collective forces, fighting side by side, achieved what neither could have accomplished alone. Human tactics provided the aggression and innovation needed to break destroyer formations, while collective technology provided the defensive capabilities to survive the engagement. But the real turning point came when the destroyer command ship found itself under attack by a formation of human fighters that had somehow penetrated all defensive screens. The enemy commander, following standard protocols, offered terms for surrender and safe passage in exchange for withdrawal. The human response was broadcast on all frequencies, heard by every ship in the engagement zone. "This is Commander Sarah Reyes of the Earth Defense Force. Your terms are rejected. Our counterterms are simple. Leave our galaxy and never return, or we'll destroy every one of your ships and hunt down any survivors. Those are your only options." Zarathul had observed enough human behavior to recognize the tone. Commander Reyes wasn't bluffing or posturing. She was stating simple fact about human intentions. The destroyer commander, programmed to respond to logical negotiating positions, found himself facing an opponent who didn't negotiate. Humans had apparently decided that the destroyers represented an existential threat, and therefore no compromise was acceptable. When the command ship's destruction became inevitable, its final transmission revealed the impact human psychology had achieved. Warning to all units. Enemy demonstrates irrational combat behavior. Threat assessment requires recalculation. These opponents do not respond to standard conflict resolution protocols. The surviving destroyer ships withdrew from the system, but Zarathul knew the larger war was far from over. The enemy would analyze this engagement, adapt their tactics, and return with new strategies. But something fundamental had changed in galactic civilization. Humans had demonstrated that the destroyers could be beaten, and they had done it not through superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but through sheer determination to win regardless of cost. In the aftermath of the battle, as rescue operations searched for survivors and medical teams treated the wounded, Zarathul observed the same patterns that had first caught their attention months earlier. Humans helping humans, strangers risking their lives for people they'd never met, individuals giving everything they had for the chance to save others. The difference now was scale. Instead of individuals making impossible choices, an entire species had chosen to fight an impossible war because the alternative was unacceptable. "Observer," Dr. Chen called out from across the command center. "We're receiving communications from something called the Collective High Council. They want to speak with you." The formal contact Zarathul had expected came as a holographic transmission showing representatives of 12 major galactic civilizations. The observer recognized several ancient species whose wisdom had guided the collective for millennia. "Observer Zarathul," the council speaker began. "Your reports on human capabilities have been reviewed. In light of recent combat performance, the council wishes to extend an offer of full membership in the collective to the human species." It was an unprecedented honor. Most species required centuries of gradual integration before achieving full membership status. "However," the speaker continued, "council deliberations have raised concerns about human psychological profiles. Your reports indicate they may be too dangerous for unrestricted contact with other member species." Zarathul looked around the command center, seeing exhausted humans working to save lives, coordinate relief efforts, and prepare for the next battle. The same people who had just fought with terrifying effectiveness were now demonstrating the compassion and cooperation that made such effectiveness possible. "With respect, Council Speaker," Zarathul replied, "I believe your concerns are misplaced. Humans are indeed dangerous to those who threaten innocent life, but they're equally protective of those who need help. The same psychological patterns that make them effective warriors make them valuable allies." The council speaker nodded thoughtfully. "We hope you are correct, observer. The final decision will rest with humanity itself. Do they choose to join galactic civilization as partners, or do they prefer independence?" Dr. Chen stepped forward, speaking for her species with the same quiet determination Zarathul had observed in countless individual humans. "We choose partnership," she said simply, "but we also choose to continue being human. We won't change who we are to fit someone else's idea of acceptable behavior. If that's what membership requires, then we'll remain independent." The observer smiled, recognizing the response as quintessentially human. They were willing to cooperate, but only as equals, and only while maintaining their essential nature. "The Council accepts those terms," the speaker replied after a brief consultation. "Welcome to the Galactic Collective, humanity. May your unique strengths serve us all." As formal diplomatic protocols began, Zarathul reflected on the journey from first contact to this moment. The observer had originally been sent to evaluate a primitive species for possible contact. Instead, they had discovered a species that would change the fundamental nature of galactic civilization. Humans brought something to the collective that had been missing, the willingness to fight impossible battles for principles that couldn't be calculated in terms of resources or survival probabilities. They brought the understanding that some things were worth any cost, and the determination to pay that cost when necessary. But most importantly, they brought the wisdom to recognize when such costs were truly necessary and when they were not. In the years that followed, as humanity integrated into galactic society and the war against the destroyers continued, Zarathul often returned to that first question about human behavior patterns. Why did humans run toward danger to help strangers? Why did they fight hardest when odds were worst? Why did they consistently choose difficult paths when easier alternatives existed? The answer, the observer finally realized, was devastatingly simple. Because someone had to. In a galaxy full of species that calculated optimal responses and chose rational strategies, humans consistently asked a different question. Not, what choice optimizes my survival probability, but what choice allows me to live with myself afterward? That difference made them both the most dangerous and most noble species in galactic civilization. It made them the natural protectors of those who couldn't protect themselves, and the natural enemies of those who preyed on the innocent. As Zarathul watched human and alien children playing together in the first integrated schools, saw human doctors treating injured collective soldiers, observed human engineers sharing impossible solutions with grateful alien scientists, the observer understood the truth about humanity's power. It wasn't their strength, or their technology, or their tactics that made humans extraordinary. It was their capacity to extend their definition of someone worth saving to include anyone and everyone who needed help, regardless of species, relationship, or reciprocal benefit. In a universe that often seemed vast, cold, and indifferent, humans insisted on caring anyway. They chose to matter, chose to make others matter, chose to fight for the simple principle that every life had value worth defending. The observer had seen beasts of incredible power and gods of transcendent wisdom in their eons of existence. But nothing in all that time had compared to the sight of a human choosing to help a stranger, knowing it might cost everything, and doing it anyway because it was the right thing to do. That was humanity's true power. Not the strength to destroy their enemies, but the courage to save their friends. In the end, Zarathul realized it was the only power that really mattered.